are all, that's good to hear. So the excerpts and the description is, I'm not going to just flat out read it to you, but that is going to be my guide. I've created the slideshow sort of just as something to look at while I'm talking. And then you have the redlined version of the contract, and then the clean version, which is easier to read, but this shows you what the changes that have been made. So that's what I have up here. In addition, I'll be looking at the slideshow a little bit, and I think I might have lost the slideshow because of that recording thing. There we go. So starting right at the top, paragraph 1, the property description. When under the personal property, if you're looking at the contract, paragraph 1 describes the property that you're selling. You're entering into a contract for the purchase and sale of real estate, but the real estate includes personal property. I have a background in computers, so I use the term hard-coded. They hard-coded into the contract certain personal property that they felt should always be included, and then they've excluded stuff or they've not included stuff. So if you want to add more on line 22 of the contract, there's a blank for other personal property included in, and you can add additional language. Again, in my full-on contract class, I will discuss that further. But for the changes are they have added thermostats, doorbells, television wall mounts, television mounting hardware, mailbox keys, and storm protection items and hardware. What they did was they changed storm shutters, storm panels to storm shutters, storm protection items and hardware. So instead of calling it panels, there's other forms of storm protection, and that's why that's included. But those things that exist on the property at the time of the effective date, at the time the contract is entered, those are automatically included in the contract. So if you have a television wall mount and you sign this contract, at the time you sign it, you've just sold your television wall mount. You don't get to take those off the wall now. That was always one of those, are mounted televisions considered a fixture? Well, we are now clarifying television wall mounts are in essence a fixture and will remain. Of course, you can always edit that. Paragraph 1E says the following items are excluded from the purchase. So if you want to exclude any items, you manually exclude them in paragraph 1E. But the change, they also have finally deleted intercoms. I think intercoms went out in the 80s. They are still on the walls and on a lot of our homes here, and especially in Beachside, we have lots of intercom homes. None of them ever work, and they are now, while they can stay physically there, they are now not automatically included as one of the items. And again, they reworded storm protection items, storm panels to storm protection items. So that's paragraph 1. Unfortunately, it's bothersome to me because I love to take questions and I enjoy the class more. But unfortunately, with the volume of material and the volume of people, we're not going to be able to take questions as we go. So you're just going to have to hear me ramble for the next hour, and then I will stay after and answer questions. And for those of you in Zoom, either put a chat or an email to Kathy, and I'll try to respond to those either live now or subsequently. All right. Paragraph 2A and E, very minor. This was really more cosmetic. They reformatted this section to expand the email addresses. If any of you have been trying to type long email addresses, and if your computer like mine does, it automatically shrinks it. It becomes like 2-point font where you need a magnifying glass and still can't read it. So they've just made the line longer so you have a little more room to work with for the email addresses. And they removed, a few years ago, they added this paragraph about collected funds and defining collected funds. The FARBAR, the collaboration, I'll call them FARBAR, it's committee, but the committee has decided that this paragraph has been around long enough. The definition of collected funds is in the standard S, and so we don't need to put it on the face. It is obvious, or as referenced in standard S, collected funds when you're referring to deposits and such. So that was a quick, easy one. Paragraph 4. It's not that it's significant what they did. They retitled it to be closing date. The idea was to draw your eye to looking for the closing date. Again, more cosmetic than anything else. They also did add that the closing, it had been defined as when all of the documents required to be furnished are delivered. Now they have changed it to include, which of course makes sense, all funds required for closing are received by the closing agent. And again, we're talking about collected funds. So a personal check would not be a collected fund. That's why, again, in my other class, I'll discuss it, but as a title company, the industry has basically, we're requiring wired transferred funds at this point. Obviously, the warning out there for wire fraud, be careful, verify wiring instructions, et cetera, but we're more concerned with check fraud and fraudulent cashier's checks as in the title industry than we are wires. Now, that said, I don't want it to sound like we're not concerned about wires. Verify your wiring instructions, make sure they're accurate, but make sure your buyers understand that they're going to have to wire the funds at closing. We're not taking a cashier's check, we're not taking a personal check, and we're not taking a bag of cash. We need a wire transfer of funds. So there's not huge changes there, but that's the change. Okay, paragraph 5, extension of the closing date. So the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that came out in 2000, I want to say 14. It really came into implementation in 2015. We've all essentially adjusted to it now. We all now use a closing disclosure instead of a settlement statement, though we have the Alta settlement statement, so we really have both. When this clause first came out, I think it was the 2015 or 16, I think it was the 2016 revision of the contract, but I might be wrong on the date. The idea was the CFPB requires by law that lenders give borrowers a certain minimum disclosure period. They have to there's a few different ones. The one we'll speak to is the 7-day. They have to give a disclosure to buyers 7 days prior to closing on some items. If they have failed to give those disclosures in a timely manner, the lender is federal law prohibited from closing the transaction until those 7 days have elapsed. So the contract calls for, they changed it from 10 days to 7 days because that's the longest disclosure that is of concern. So that's one change in the contract, is from 10 days to 7. And they are clarifying, because I had never experienced this. We have had some delays with CFPB. It is a mandatory, if you read the contract, the closing date shall be extended for up to 7 days to provide the CFPB exposures. So apparently some people have taken advantage of that and saying, oh, we get to have an extension of the closing because we didn't get our disclosures, when they hadn't even been approved for the loan yet. And they were trying to ride on a disclosure paragraph to extend their right to get the loan. So that's done away with. This is a CFPB disclosure extension only. This is not an opportunity to still extend your period for loan approval or anything else. So that's pretty much, if you read the paragraph, that's what the revised language is intended to cover. I'm trying to turn my page to the revised language, but we'll go on. So again, I always want to say any questions, but I don't believe I have time to do that. So we'll go on here. Paragraph 6, occupancy and possession. So again, this is a very important thing to understand. It's one of the things I discuss in the class regarding loopholes and being careful. What they've done in this, the revision that they've made is, one, they've added language regarding seasonal and short-term vacation rentals. So let me step back and state that occupancy is under the Florida FAR Bar contract and the standards of Florida practice. Other states do things differently, but in the state of Florida, the standard and the contract provides that occupancy shall be delivered at closing. So when you show up at closing, when your seller shows up, they're supposed to hand over a key and not go back to the house and say, oh, wait, I got to move some stuff out of my house. When they show up at closing, they're supposed to turn over the key and no longer have access or occupancy of the property. Now, we all know that occasionally things happen where a seller needs a few extra days, which we're wholly opposed to, but it sometimes happens. And sometimes a buyer needs to get in there early. Really opposed to that and highly recommend against it. However, it happens. And what they've done is they've added a rider T. The rider's always been there. They added a reference to the rider so that if you're going to have pre-closing occupancy by the buyer, we are referencing C rider T. Now, if you look down on paragraph B, 6B, the last sentence is C rider U for post-closing occupancy by seller. That's always been there. They're just adding rider T's reference above in case it's pre-occupancy by the buyer. Now, as far as the short-term and seasonal rentals, the contract unchanged portion of it is that the buyer shall provide copy of written leases the seller shall provide to the buyer copy of unwritten leases within 5 days of the effective date. That's one of those loopholes you need to be aware of. It's a dangerous loophole for you because it's a shall. The seller shall provide it, and then the buyer has time to review those leases and has the right to cancel the contract within 5 days of receipt of it. So if your seller doesn't provide the written leases, and then we get close to closing and the buyer's trying to squirrel out of the deal, but he hasn't gotten the written leases yet, I come in as the attorney and say, hey, we need a copy of those leases. Oh man, I can't believe you used that font. I am not accepting this lease, and we're off, we're canceling the contract. We have the absolute right if the terms of the lease, terms of occupancy are not acceptable to buyers. So my font thing may or may not fly, but we can find terms of the occupancy that are not acceptable and cancel the contract. So you want to make sure you close the loophole by providing leases within 5 days of the effective date. And that gives the buyer 5 days from receipt to cancel, but at least you start that clock going. They're still excited with the deal, so they don't cancel. By the time they're ready to cancel, they don't have that contingency or loophole to drive through. Now, what they've done on the change here is they're not required to provide estoppel letters and such for seasonal and vacation rentals. So you don't have to hunt down these vacation rental tenants and say, hey, have you paid your security deposit, or is there any last month's rent, or things like that. So that's what the change in the paragraph primarily is. And actually that's all of it. Okay, again, I don't take questions, so I move on. This one is big, and I'm so happy they did this one. And in the next slide, you're going to get to the one I'm so unhappy about. But this one I'm so happy about. The assignability. The old form it's unchanged in the sense of the old form had 3 checkboxes: may assign and be released, may assign and not be released, or may not assign the contract. I had always advised sellers to check the may not assign box. And if you're a buyer, again, depending on your circumstances, you might check any of the 3, depending on what's in the buyer's best interest. But when a box was unchecked, under Florida law, all contracts are assignable unless otherwise stated. So when the former versions of this contract had no default, the law steps in, and the default under the law was it is assignable. So I always told sellers, make sure you check the may not assign. You can always change your mind and allow somebody to assign it, but if you don't change your mind, then at least you've prevented the buyer from assigning it. And there is anecdotes to that, but again, I don't think time's going to permit. So basically, this has shifted the burden. If a buyer wants to assign the contract, they need to check the box, may assign and be released, or may assign and not be released. And again, it doesn't have the default language like a commercial contract does, which says the commercial contract, the default language is may assign to a related entity. This doesn't have that language. So if I sign it in my name, but I want to put it in an LLC, I need to assign it to the LLC. I need to state that it's assignable. And then I explain that to the seller. Look, I'm not assigning it to some third party. I'm just assigning it to my LLC. You check the may assign without release liability, and everybody's happy. But if you do nothing, if you leave it blank, which I've seen many contracts come through blank, the new rule, which is a complete opposite to the old rule, is it is now not assignable. So I think that's a good change, because most sellers wouldn't want it to automatically be assignable, and that's what the default had been. Okay, I'm doing all right, I think, on time, but not really. So financing. I'm going to skip this. I am coming back to it. This is the most substantive change. This is going to take the longest amount of time to cover. I want to make sure I get through all the minor stuff first, and then I'll come back and spend the rest of my time, whatever that is, on financing. With that said, I have been advised that the Florida Association of Realtors is putting together some form of presentation or information on financing alone. Again, this is a major change, and I will be covering it. You can look on the screen briefly as to what some of it is. This is my weakest slide. I need to add several slides to it. So I will come back to financing shortly. So don't get upset when I go like that. So we're now on God, if I could not come back to it, I could skip 3 or 4 pages of lecture here. But now I'm going to turn my 3 or 4 pages, 5 pages, and get to paragraph 9. So paragraph 9, some of it is very minor. Again, be aware. I'm kind of teaching the contract class again, but be aware, standard paragraph 9 are the costs that are built into the contract. Paragraph 9A are the costs that the seller will be expected to pay. Paragraph 9B are the costs that the buyer will be expected to pay. And then paragraph 9C, my favorite being a title guy, are the title expenses and who pays those. So, and again, it's referenced in A and B, who pays whatever is contained in C. So there have been not much in the way of substantive changes in paragraph 9. So I'm just basically telling you, check it out, make sure you're aware of it. They did add in paragraph 9A as a seller's obligation that if there are any charges for FIRPTA withholding or reporting, those charges belong to the seller. FIRPTA is Foreign Investors in Real Property Tax Act. If you have a foreign investor, a non-US citizen who is selling real estate in the United States, there is an obligatory withholding of the 15% of the net proceeds, I'm sorry, of the gross proceeds, not the net proceeds, and that's the issue. It's 15% of the gross proceeds. Now, there are exclusion, there are rules. I'm not giving tax advice, I'm not giving FIRPTA advice. You need to speak with an accountant or somebody who has experience on that, or you can speak to me offline and I can give you some information. However, online here, just be aware that FIRPTA is relevant to your foreign investors. And as a quick aside, I'll throw out, if you have buyers who are foreign investors, they're not a problem as a buyer. Anybody can buy property in the United States, but when they go to sell it, they'll then be subject to FIRPTA. So you may want to advise any non-US buyers of the existence of FIRPTA so that they might want to do some planning that might enable them to better or more easily sell the property when the time comes. So that's FIRPTA. Paragraph 9C, again, title guy, I like this one. I don't think this was highlighted anywhere. Let me double check that. I think I just highlighted it because I care. Double check, what did I call it? 9. Well, yeah, it was a little bit. It's line 168 on the, or no, I'm sorry, 188 on the contract. So what it's saying is that the seller shall furnish a prior owner's title insurance policy, if any, within 5 days after the effective date. Now, that often benefits the seller because it makes the transaction go more smoothly. The way it works in the title industry is we draw a line, we do a title search. If we have no prior title information, there's what's called the Marketable Record Title Act, or MARTA, and MARTA helps clear title and makes title marketable, but you have to go back to a deed that has been of record at least 30 years, so 30 years or more. Now, I started practicing in the, well, on the computer actually in the late 70s as a child with my father, but in the 80s when I actually started practicing, and the computer only went back to like 71, so we had to order searches that were 30-year searches. Now, remarkably, most 30-year searches are within the computer now, which is great. But if you have a deed from the 60s, it still predates the computer. You still have to do back searches. We can draw a line from a prior owner's policy. So if somebody bought it in 2010, I don't have to search beyond 2010. I can rely on that title insurance policy and then do my search from there forward. The advantage of that is I'm a really good title examiner, and sometimes that's bad, because if I have to search beyond 2010, I might find a problem that somebody else didn't find an insured over. Well, if I find it, I can't ignore it. I then have to reach out to the insurance company and see if we can get an indemnity letter, and it can drag on. If I draw my line at 2010, I don't have to look beyond that, and I don't have to look for problems that might have pre-existed, because in my mind, somebody's already looked at it, insured it, and I don't have to second guess their work. So there is value in the title insurance policy to the seller, but they always don't know it. They don't provide it. I can't find it. I can't look for it. The contract says they shall furnish it if it exists within 5 days of the effective date. I don't know that that'll ever be enforced as a shall, because you can't prove they had a possession of it, but I highly recommend you provide the title insurance policy. And then one quick aside on that, if it's within 3 years, if it's not really a flip within 3 years, but if they're flipping it within 3 years, they actually get a discount on the title insurance if they provided the prior policy. So for those short-term flips, there's some incentive to that as well. Okay, moving on. They have added Chapter 153 is added to the municipal lien search definition. I looked that up last night, and it just has to do with water bills under a certain sort of water and sewer bills. So basically, they're just clarifying language that Chapter 153 is included when we're dealing with municipal lien searches. And lastly, a mildly substantive change. I mean, it is substantive, actually, it's not mildly, is paragraph 9D deals with a survey. And paragraph 9D says that a buyer can obtain a survey at buyer's expense, blah, blah, blah. And they have, the old version was they had the right to object to a problem in the survey within the title evidence period, which is contained in 9C. They've changed that to within 5 days of closing, 5 days prior to closing. And according to the literature, if you will, the comments, that was to give surveyors more time to get the survey done. Also, best practice as a title company, when I order a survey, if I send it with a title insurance commitment, again, I do teach a commitment class, and you should probably take it to learn about all the exceptions in a title commitment. The title commitment has exceptions that include easements and other type matters that might appear on a survey, mostly easements. If the surveyor has that, they can draw the easements right onto the survey, which is kind of the point of it. If a surveyor doesn't have the title, they don't have the easements. They might have some of them are off the plat, so they will know about some of them, but some things might not get drawn on the survey that is valuable information. So the idea was, we as a title company will provide the surveyor with the title commitment, then they'll do their survey, not have the two processes overlap and not necessarily have complete information. So it is substantive, probably won't affect you guys in your daily practice, but it's always good to be aware. All right, paragraph 9F, that's always that fun one where if you're the seller, you check A, if you're the buyer, you check B. If the default is A, what this deals with is, what is the word I'm looking for here? Pardon me, it's contained, where's the paragraph? Special, oh no, that's where it does not apply. Give me a second, I apologize for the delay. I'm trying to find the language I'm looking for. Liens imposed by a public body, that's the word I was looking for. So, and it's right there on the screen. So liens that are imposed by a public body, that would be the example I always use as a street lighting improvement district. If they've come through and said, we're gonna put street lights and everybody's gonna get charged $10,000 to put street lights in the neighborhood, but we're gonna do $1,000 a year for 10 years, it'll be on your tax bill. If paragraph A is checked, then the seller pays up through the date of closing, it's on the tax bill, the buyer takes over and keeps paying. Paragraph B is checked, the seller has to pay the entire $10,000. If it's year 3, they might owe $7,000. Not most people, but many people aren't even aware that these things are on their tax bill because of when they bought it or they weren't paying attention or whatnot. So it is something to be careful about. What the only change they've made here is they've added, there are special district assessments assessed under Chapter 189, in addition to the community development district assessments under Chapter 190 of the Florida statutes. They have now specifically excluded those from this paragraph, and therefore they are included in standard K, which is the standard proration exemptions. And so anything that's CDD related, Chapter 190, or special district related, Chapter 189, is automatically prorated to the day of closing, i.e. it's as if paragraph A was checked. It's just part of the proration. It's really not part of that. The other thing is some public body liens cannot be paid in advance. Apparently, when they made this change, the committee wasn't aware that some public bodies would not accept the money in advance. So again, using my street lighting improvement district, you're paying $1,000 a year and you want to just pay it off. They might say no. Some might say, nope, you got to pay it $1,000 a year. We won't take payment in advance. I don't know why or when that would happen, but if it does, then it's automatically as if paragraph A was checked. So we don't have to go through a dance. The contract accounts for, if the public body says no, the answer is no. Okay, that's that one. Paragraph 10, disclosures. Okay, so not a major change, but in 2019, the Florida statutes were amended to allow procedures by which permits could be closed or disposed of, expired permits, things like that, that can be taken off the books under chapter 553.79 of the Florida statutes. So they just added this into the contract. So if you have open permits, or you have to disclose them, et cetera. However, if they can be closed in addition to just being closed, if they can be disposed of pursuant to 553, that is also now included in paragraph 10. So again, it's not a huge issue, but it's out there for permitting purposes. And then paragraph 11, this is not a change, but if you were to refer back to paragraph 9A, we talked about the seller's expenses that are hard coded in paragraph 9A. Now I'm going to it myself. And starting on line 170, actually, I'm looking at the red line version, so it might not be 170. Yeah, it's actually 142 on the non-red line version. That paragraph has always been there, that if prior to closing the maintenance requirements had not been met, then there's an escrow procedure. So all they did was refer to that so people would be aware, hey, if you didn't meet the maintenance requirements of paragraph 11, then there is already a escrow procedure in paragraph 9A. So again, there's more of a reference than it is an actual substantive change. Standards for, let's see, what am I? So the standards. So there were a variety. The standards are beginning, I think it's paragraph 18, and it has a whole bunch of standards. You guys really should read these. It's really boring. You're gonna fall asleep a few different times, but when you wake up, remember where you were, maybe go back a paragraph and reread that one, but get through this because there's a lot of stuff in there and a lot of it might surprise you. And of course, if you're presenting these contracts to your clients, you ought to know what it says. You're not an attorney. You don't have to give legal advice as to what it says, but it sure would be nice that you knew what it said. So please read the standards. The standards that have changed, a couple, again, fairly substantive. The old contract under time, and again, I will overemphasize this, time is of the essence. They actually overemphasized it by moving it. I think that's one of the changes they make, was moving the phrase time is of the essence. My standard F. Yeah, so they put it right at the first sentence and in bold, time is of the essence of this contract. What that means, again, I'm going back to my contract lecture, but I'm going to do it. Time is of the essence means any provisions in the contract that call for something to happen in a certain period of time is an essential provision to the contract, and failure to abide by that is a default. If you don't do something that's supposed to happen on day 3, you do it on day 4, you're already in default because day 3 was essential to somebody when they drafted the contract or when you sign the contract. So time is of the essence is significant, and the computation of time can vary from contract to contract to contract. This is, I'm not sure, it's the third change that I've seen in the time provision over the last 15 years, but it's always important if somebody presents you with a contract from another area. Again, they're not using the FAR contract, maybe using the FAR contract, or in the old days, I don't know if they're still doing it, but like Fort Lauderdale had their own version of a contract, or other Southwest Florida had one. So there are different areas that might have a slightly revised FAR, if you will. Always look to see what time is. The most common trick, if you will, is if time is business days instead of calendar days. So again, be aware of that. Now, with that said, we're dealing with the FAR contract and the changes that were made to it. In this case, we are a calendar day contract, and it says that very clearly. It's a calendar days. One of the added changes is to clarify, which almost seems silly, but I guess it's not in our global world, to clarify that it's the time is based on where the property is located. And I guess if you got two people, you know, overseas, one in Europe and one in Asia, and they're doing business on Florida property, they might think that they're operating under whatever European or Asian time that is. I don't know my time zones, but you know, they might think it's some other time zone and that's what's relevant to them. No, the time is Florida Eastern Standard Time. I don't know if Pensacola might be on the other side, but it's wherever the property is located. That's the time zone we're dealing with, and the time in that zone. So that was one add. The other is that when time periods, this is not new, but with the change, when time periods end on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday, they added the word public. So now it reads national legal public holiday. And that is defined in the US Code section 6103A or 5 USC 6103A. So in any event, you can look up in the US Code what are national legal public holidays. If a time period occurs on or ends on Saturday, Sunday, or national holiday, or, and this is the change, or a date on which such holiday is observed. So if July 4th is on a Sunday, then Monday is the day we observe it, July 5th. A time period that ends on July 5th, Monday, July 5th, actually extends to the next business day. So they've included observance of national legal public holidays, not just the holiday itself. That's the one change. The other fairly substantive change is in the old contract, and again, I've had this conversation a lot over the years, a day ends at 11:59 p.m. At midnight, it's the new day. So 11:59 is when a day ends, and that's when you have to do whatever a contractual requirement is, except in the old contract, if it ended on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, the contract read it would extend to 5 p.m. on the next business day. So they put this 5 p.m. on the extension. They have now removed that. So the new version of the contract completely removes this 5 p.m. thing, and days now end as they do at 11:59 p.m. So if you have a contract, an inspection period, a loan approval, appraisal, any of those things that end on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday, or the observance thereof, it extends to the next business day in the area where the property is located, and that ends at 11:59 p.m. All right, got it. That is significant though, so be aware of it. Okay, force majeure. Those are what they've done here. Force majeure are, it used to be referred to as acts of God, but it's not just acts of God, as evidenced by some of the things they've added and some of the things that have always been there. And it is things outside the control of the parties. So buyer and seller enter into this agreement and they agree to close on a certain date. Well, it turns out a hurricane is hit and the title company is closed and there's no electricity and there's no insurance available. And we can't close. We're actually prevented from closing because of force majeure is the phrase that is used. Now, force majeure has been expanded, so you can read the definition of what's already there. I guess I should turn my page to be able to read it. So force majeure means, I'm going to do this very quickly, hurricanes, floods, extreme weather, earthquakes, fires, or other acts of God, unusual transportation delays, wars, insurrections. They've added civil unrest, or acts of terrorism. They've added governmental actions and mandates, government shutdowns, epidemics, or pandemics. So they've added pandemics, shocking, unfortunate as well. And I hope we are coming to the end of pandemics and never see another one in my lifetime. But if the force majeure, so they've expanded the definition a little to include civil unrest and government shutdowns and things like that. So again, if you can't get access to your money or whatever the case may be, through no fault of your own, then there will be an extension. When does that extension start and end? It starts on the first day that you're prevented from doing whatever it is you were supposed to do. So the example given in the literature here is if you have a hurricane, before the hurricane hits, you can't get insurance because it's in the box. And so, oops, excuse me. So that's preventing you from doing whatever you need to do, right? So that's just an example of it starts when you can't do something you needed to do. The other substantive change they made, and it is, again, and I think it's one of those that would have been argued anyway, but they've made it hard-coded, is it includes the interference with the ability to perform a right in addition to just an obligation. So it used to read buyer and seller shall not be required to perform any obligation under a contract. They now add shall not be required to exercise or perform any right or obligation. And they've added right or obligation in a couple of places. And the idea being you have a right to do a walkthrough. You're not obligated to do a walkthrough, but you have a right to do a walkthrough. If you're prevented from doing the walkthrough, you're prevented from exercising a right that's contained in the contract, that can fall under the force majeure provision and be extended. Now, they didn't change the extension, which is 7 days from the beginning of the event, I'm sorry, from the end of the event, but no more than 30 days if the event were to last so long. So that's force majeure. We're probably, I don't know if I'm good on time or not, so we'll just keep going. FinCEN GTO reporting obligation. So most of you probably don't know much about this. Brevard County is not overly covered by it, but Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, and other areas. This is meant for the government to track money. So when buyers are buying for cash, it's money laundering, that kind of thing. That's the purpose of the FinCEN GTO reporting obligations. Well, title companies are obligated to make a report and file it with FinCEN when we have a cash transaction where we can't identify the source of the funds, et cetera. And we have to inquire of the buyer. There's a laundry list of information we need to get from a buyer in order to abide by our title obligations to report this data. So this change in the contract, for where it went here, but in any event, you know what, it might not have been here, but in any event, the change in the contract is just obligating, it's mandating the buyer's cooperation. So the buyer, especially if they are in fact money laundering, they can't say, no, I'm not providing you that information. And if they do, they're in breach of the contract because I need that information to proceed to the closing. So that's, again, hopefully not substantive to any of you, but again, be aware of it, especially if you have cash buyers. There's a limited circumstances, but cash buyers and in certain counties, which Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, I believe Palm Beach is included. I don't think Brevard is, but again, we'll check on that. So prorations, all they've done here is they've added a chapter 189 assessments. That's what we talked about on that paragraph 9F. The CDD, the Community Development District, chapter 190, they've now added special tax district of chapter 189 are now included in the standard prorations, as opposed to having the choice of if it's payable in advance, the seller pays it all and or the buyer takes over. Now it's just a standard proration. All right, this one is another one of those very significant ones to our practice. I always harp on paragraph O in my contract class. How am I on time? I can't see the clock, unfortunately, because it's covered by something. No idea what time it is. Okay, I'll just, thank you. So notice and delivery. All notices must be in writing. That is not a change. They may only be made by mail, facsimile transmission, personal delivery, or email. The change here is that they have removed the phrase or electronic, including PDF media. So they've removed or electronic media. I wasn't in the room when it happened, no reference to Hamilton intended, but the electronic media, as I understand it, would be texts and also social media postings, things like that. So notice and delivery has to be in writing, and you have to either mail it, fax it, hand deliver it, or email is acceptable. You can't text something and have it be deemed to be, hey, I send it in writing as a text and I sent you that notice. And again, the philosophy behind it is that texts are impermanent. The texts don't stay on your phone forever. If you are in court and a court case goes 2 or 3 years, it's harder to gather the evidence of old text to show that this happened. That's the reasoning behind it. Same thing like social media postings. You can't, again, I don't know who would do this, but post on Facebook, I've accepted your contract. So whatever the thinking is there, the idea now is you have to communicate it only by mail, fax, personal delivery, or email. Again, time is not going to permit me to go into too much detail on that. Do come to my class for more information on O. The one thing I'm going to throw it out there because I can't stop myself, is when notice is given to an attorney or broker, including such brokers, real estate licensee representing any party, that notice shall be as effective as if given to that party. So again, I emphasize this in my regular class. I'm going to emphasize it now. If I, as one side of the table, provide notice to you as the other side of the table, it is deemed that your client, let's say your client's the buyer, your client has received that notice. So if I tell you there's a problem, you know, and I've disclosed it to you pursuant to the contract, and you don't tell your buyer, and then something goes wrong later, and the buyer hires an attorney, and the attorney says, did you get that notice? And the buyer says, no, I never got that notice. And I say, great, we have a case. And then it turns out you got the notice, then you've got a problem, and I've just lost my case. So anytime you receive notice, it's imperative that you pass that on to your client, because it's deemed that they've received it, whether they have or not. And again, we don't ever want to think litigation, but if it comes to that, everybody's going to be looking who to point the finger at, and you don't want it to be you. So that's my notice and delivery. And again, now it has to be made by mail, fax, personal delivery, or email, no text and no social media. Okay, counteroffer. This is again more of the a cosmetic change. I don't think I've ever seen it used. Actually, once I did see it used once. I shouldn't say that, because I kind of remember one time, but it has always been on the contract. At the very end of the contract, there was a paragraph called counteroffer, and it says that seller counters the buyer's offer, and the buyer has a certain amount of time to accept it, or seller rejects it. Well, they just removed the seller rejects part. And the idea again behind it was sellers were just not accepting contracts. They weren't physically saying, I hereby reject it. They just didn't accept it. And when you don't accept it, the offer expires, and that's the end of that. So they eliminated the it was never an obligation. That's why they eliminated it. They eliminated the appearance of an obligation for a seller to reject a contract. They had never had an obligation to reject it, and now there's not even a way to do so in writing. So if you want a counteroffer, you check the counteroffer box and then there is a counteroffer addendum. I don't see that used all that often either. It's a good idea in a theoretical sense. You check the box, you add the counteroffer addendum, and you reference everything. But from a simplicity standpoint, it's obviously easier to just cross through and write an initial, and that's what we all tend to do. So that's the counteroffer change. New riders, they've added a couple of riders. The seasonal vacation rentals, if you are dealing with a seasonal vacation rental, there's a provision, is the seller allowed to continue to rent it during the term of the contract? Do they need the buyer's approval to do so or not? And so again, you can take an eyeball at that. And PACE is, I think that should be all caps actually, so it might be a typo on my part in that regard. But the PACE disclosure, when you have these PACE loans, which I forget what it stands for, but I'm hoping to turn to the page real quickly. No, I'm too slow. Property assessed clean energy disclosure. So again, it's a financing provided by the government that gets added to the non-ad valorem tax bill, but it can sometimes be paid off early. It's a loan. It's a loan that homeowners get for doing energy efficient improvements to their property. And if that loan doesn't get recorded as a mortgage, it gets recorded as a lien against the property. I mean, a tax, it's part of the tax bill is how it gets paid back. So it can be paid in advance though, sometimes not. Well, actually it can always be paid in advance, and whether it needs to be disclosed. Again, if any of you dealt with PACE, then you need to have that disclosure rider. It is a required disclosure if there's a PACE loan. Then they've revised a few riders again. All right, I'm not in great shape because I got to go back to financing still, but we'll get there. So the amended riders, they're mostly minor. Take a look at the red lines of them. Again, I'm available for questions, but there was nothing that I felt overly substantive. They were mostly cosmetic type changes. Now, the pre-closing and post-closing occupancy have now been referred to in paragraph 6. And again, you should use them and read them. Actually, the truth is you should never use them and never allow pre or post occupancy. But in those circumstances, when you have no choice, use the rider to do it. The one that has become substantive in that it relates to the financing is the sale of buyer's property rider. So I will address that when we get to the financing in a few seconds, but if the sale is contingent, if the purchase in this case is contingent upon a buyer selling their property, this rider has always existed. They have reworded it slightly, so it's a little bit amended, but now the attachment of the rider now ties in with loan approval. So I'm going to slip back in a moment to address that, but be aware that if you have a contingency sale on the buyer's property, then make sure that you use the rider because it adds additional protections with regard to the loan approval that are not otherwise there. If it's a cash transaction, you still want to use it because you want it to be contingent if the buyer needs that money for the cash anyway. So, and that's me, but I'm not really done. So I'll get back to me in a moment. Okay, this, like I said, is not a great slide. I'm actually going to use the handout with the explanation as my guide to discussing the financing provisions here. So I'm going to kind of go through this, though everything on the slide is accurate. I think this lays it out a little bit better on a proverbial line by line basis. So, all right, here's my rant, and it is a rant. In 04 and 07, I was always so upset because paragraph A reads, this is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. To be truthful, I pulled it out and I scanned it, but I didn't put it in the slideshow. I pulled out the 04, 07, 10, 13, 14, 16, 17, and 19 contracts and scanned the financing paragraphs to watch how they've changed over the years. And I would love to have pulled that up, but again, time didn't permit. So in 04 and 07, it read, this is a cash transaction with no contingency for financing. I'm trying to remember what it said. Funny, just because it said no contingency for financing as opposed to no financing contingency. So they flip-flopped the words, but they've gone back in time to 2004. I'm upset by it because while there's no financing contingency, it doesn't prohibit a buyer from getting a loan. So in my mind, in 2010, when they added the language that are now deleting, it's saying the buyer will pay back for the property. There's no contingency, but if buyer obtains a loan, blah, blah, blah. So it's making it clear to a seller that the buyer might be getting a loan. There's no contingency. If they don't get the loan, they can lose the deal. They're not covered by, the protections of paragraph B, but it makes it clear that they might get a loan. Therefore, an appraiser still might have to go to the property to appraise it. And there's other things that a loan might require that a seller should accommodate, even though it's a cash transaction. And the reason this comes up is because in 04 and 05, I had fights with people. We were in a market not unlike today's market where everything was flying off the shelf and sellers would only take cash contracts because they didn't want to have to deal with lenders, and buyers would say, I know I'm going to get the loan. So they check the cash contract, but they still get a loan. And then a seller would say, you can't get a loan. It's a cash contract. And it doesn't prohibit them from getting a loan. It's just, there's no contingency if they don't. And now we've gone back in time. It doesn't legally change anything. It's still not preventing a buyer from getting a loan. It's just now opening a door for a seller to complain, in my personal ranting opinion. But the punchline is, if you check A, there's no financing contingency, and the buyer better come to the table with the money to close by whatever source, or they're not protected under paragraph B, which is what we'll get to now. Paragraph B was changed immensely. And again, that's why we only have 7 minutes for this one slide, now 6. I will stay and I will do my best. But the main changes, well, there's several, it's hard to say main, but the most significant change is they have incorporated the appraisal into loan approval. So you now have two pieces of the loan approval puzzle. You not only have to get approved for the loan based on your credit and your income and all of that good stuff, you also have to, the property has to get approved based on an appraisal. Now, the old form had a portion that said, if you get loan approval and the contract doesn't close because the property didn't appraise for an amount sufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval, then the buyer could get a deposit back. So there was a loan approval contingency in the old version, but they have now moved that appraisal contingency into really the definition of loan approval. And the theory on it was to have everything, expedited. I don't know that this expedites anything, but the idea was, you're given 30 days for loan approval. You need to have all of your underwriting done, all of your income and credit checks and all of that done, but you also have to have the appraisal done and approved. And I think the thinking, or at least as I read it, part of the thinking is a lot of times the appraisal will come in and there will be some repairs that are necessary, or it won't be approved again, if it's a low dollar amount, that's what it is. But if it turns out to be appraisal, repair, contingency stuff, at least we now know about it, and we'll know about it during the loan approval period and can either attend to it and still keep the contract alive, or cancel it because it's not going to be approved within this loan approval period. So again, I can't, this is too new for all of us to really wrap our brains around all of the many effects that'll happen because of this, because there will be unintended consequences. There always are. So it keeps me as a lawyer busy. But there's the punchline to you guys in the preparation of the contract is realize that the appraisal needs to be done as, you know, within the loan approval period. So you can't get, okay, I got loan approval. Great, the loan approval is done. I got loan approval, but it's subject to an appraisal. No, then you don't have loan approval, and you're not, you know, the period, you still have your whole period. If you got loan approval on day 15, but you don't have the appraisal yet, you don't have loan approval. And it is relevant the way the contingency ties itself together. So I'll try to expound on that a little bit more as we go through the changes here. So again, we've redefined loan approval to both be the approval of the buyer as well as the approval of the property. They did include alternatives to appraisal. That's the other change that they made. It doesn't have to just be an appraisal. It can be an alternative valuation. And again, I fear this opens up doors, but we'll see what happens. But some lenders don't require an appraisal. Some will just take a, you know, maybe a RPR search or something like that, or a broker price opinion or some other valuation that's different than a formal appraisal. So they have included language that says that the lender's receipt of an appraisal or other valuation sufficient for the loan approval. So again, they've expanded what appraisal means a little bit, but it's still within this approval period. Kind of those to get this accurate here. Okay, so again, just moving on through this chart, the buyer does have to use good faith and diligent effort. That hasn't really changed. They have to pay for, they reworded it slightly as opposed to paying all fees, et cetera. They say paying for appraisal and other fees and charges. So again, a buyer can't sabotage their ability to get the loan approval by not paying for something or not providing their tax returns and all of that. None of that is a change though. That's always the way it's been. So moving on to paragraph or within 8B2, the contract always provided that the seller and broker should A, be kept fully informed of the process, and B, that the buyer authorizes release of that information from the lender to the seller or broker, so that the seller or broker can verify that they've applied and everything's going the way it's supposed to. I always, in my regular class, chuckle at that because the truth is lenders are not really going to release it based on this contract provision, I don't think. But again, you can send it to them and say, look, the buyer signed it and says I'm allowed to know. And I think they added as appropriate and allowed to cover the lender saying no. And the other thing that they've added, though, it has to be upon written request. So it's no longer that the buyer shall keep the seller informed. The buyer, upon written request, shall keep the seller informed. It's removing a burden on the buyer to do something automatically. So they have to do it. If I ask for it as a seller, you have to tell me as a buyer, but you don't have to tell me if I don't ask. So it's just a slight obligatory change, but it's a little bit relevant. So again, the written request. And then the other thing that got added is they have to specifically inform the seller of any property related conditions contained within the loan approval. So again, if the process is saying, hey, we got, you know, your property's approved, but you got to fix that wood rod on the door, otherwise we won't close. You got to tell the seller that, because it gives the seller the opportunity to deal with it one way or the other, however they choose to deal with it. But you don't get to just say, yeah, I got a loan approval, and then, you know, not tell them that it was subject to these property related conditions. You do need to disclose it. Again, the idea is that we get to closings, not that we have loopholes to get out of closings down the road, or something that can't be fixed and it's too late. We could have had time and now we don't. So that's the kind of the underlying purpose of it. I'm really out of time. Like I said, the financing. So I'm going to keep going, but anybody who has to leave, I get that. We will have another class that will cover this and more, but I'm going to just keep on talking because I got it. So another substantive difference here then is if the buyer obtains loan approval, they have to notify the seller in writing. They've expanded it to the end of the loan approval period. So they don't have to do it right away. You can sit on it. You can do whatever you want with the loan approval unless the seller requested in writing. But the buyer does have to specifically notify the seller in writing that they've either obtained loan approval, which includes the appraisal. In other words, we're done, loan approval is done, or that, hey, I don't have the loan approval, but I know I'm going to get it. And I find this odd language, but that's what it says. The buyer is satisfied with their ability to obtain loan approval. So if I send you a letter that says, nope, I don't have it yet, but I'm satisfied I'm going to get it, I'm staying in the deal is still alive, then they're protected by other provisions. If they don't send the written notice, if they don't get approved, or the other language they've added then. So if I get turned down for the loan, I got to send a notice that I got turned down. Or if I get approved, but it says you're approved, provided you can come up with $100 million by tomorrow. So if there's something in the approval that the buyer cannot in good faith and due diligent effort come up with $100 million tomorrow, then the buyer, even with a loan approval, if it has this crazy condition in it, the buyer can cancel. Both written notices that I got approved, or I'm going to get approved and I'm okay with that, or I'm canceling the deal, or I'm canceling the deal because I didn't get approved, or because I got approved but I can't close anyway. So either of those notices have to be timely delivered within the loan approval period. That's the hugely significant issue. If they don't provide a written notice, if they are silent as to the issue, then it's a different result than it used to be. So you provide the written notice, we're good to go. Either we've canceled the deal or we're moving on with the deal. If you don't provide the written notice, two possibilities. One that always existed and then the new one. So the one that always existed is the seller has 3 days from the end of the loan approval period to cancel the deal. You didn't send me a written notice that you got approved. You didn't send me a written notice that you got turned down. So I'm canceling the deal. No, wait, I got approved. Too late. You didn't send the written notice at the end of the loan approval period. You don't have that choice anymore. Your choices are gone. You have until that 30th day. On day 31, the ball's out of your court and I can cancel the deal. I have 3 days as a seller to cancel the deal. If I don't cancel it within the 3 days, we're moving on as if it were a cash transaction. So the deal doesn't automatically terminate. The deal's not automatically dead, but it is now a cash transaction with none of the protections of paragraph B, which go on to say, if buyer timely delivers written notice, is paragraph V as in Victor, or 5, really, Roman numeral 5, then buyer shall proceed forward. If they don't provide the notice, then it's again, forward as if it were a cash contract. That wasn't the clause I was looking for. If the buyer timely provides either of the notices required, then thereafter fails to close, seller gets the deposit unless the seller's in default, or property related conditions of the loan approval excluding appraisal valuation. So again, a loan approval can have property related conditions. Like I said, fixing wood rot or something like that. I'm not great at coming up with examples, but there could be property related conditions. And if it doesn't close because of those, and the buyer has given all their written notices, then the buyer can get their deposit back. But if the buyer has failed to give the written notices, now it's a cash transaction. Now paragraph B6 doesn't apply. We're now on paragraph BA, I'm sorry, paragraph A, 8A, cash transaction. If you don't give the notice, it's a cash deal, you have no protection. So a silent buyer is no longer protected. A buyer who provides notice that I think I'm going to get approved or I got approved, if you say I'm not going to get approved, you cancel and you get your money back as long as you do it timely. But if you don't do that and you don't close, you lose your deposit. Now, if you did it and you don't close because of property related conditions or a seller's default, then you're protected. So interesting twist that just popped into my head is, what if the seller was a default anyway? And there's a nice little lawsuit for us to address in another day. So Okay, so again, the idea on the property related conditions is that the property can either be attended to or can be resolved, the return to the market, that kind of thing. So, and that is it. Okay, I only went 5 minutes over, so that's pretty good for me. Who's ever taken my class, that's really good. I'm willing to stay and answer questions. I'll stand up here. I'll take them from you. I don't know how we can do it on Zoom. I'm sorry I didn't look up at you Zoomers. I usually do, but I was talking to them. Thank you all very much and good luck. And look out for the next class, which will be the whole thing. Yeah, thank you. There you go. Oh, you're very welcome. Great. Thank you. Yes, so much to get through.
Oh, I know. I had just a